We were all that day. One thing they don't teach you, as all of you know, when you go through elementary school, high school, is how to whistle. So I didn't really know how to get anybody's attention other than to say, we're going to start. Hey, welcome. Thank you all for coming and being here and filling the room and just being a part. A couple of announcements as we kind of start today and as we start to begin to put some formality to structuring a Sunday morning and in preparation for next week, which is August 30th. Who remembers from last week what next week is? Not going to be in here. That's correct. So we're going to be in Sheridan. Good. So next week at 7 a.m. if you'd like to come, we're just going to, some of us are going to go set up. You don't all have to be there at all, but at 7 a.m. we'll kind of open the doors, begin to prep for that morning, and set up whatever we need from an audio-visual perspective, make sure the chairs are where they need to be, understand where the stage will be, all of those dynamics that we'll learn together as we go. So that'll start at between 7 and 8, and then service would start at 10, and then we need to be done, and we'll begin to pack up at about 11:15. So that will be the next Sunday, August 30th, between 7 and 8. We'll be at the Sheridan Fraser, and then we'll be done by 11:15. We'll tear down whatever we would have that would be our own, and then we would depart. So that will be what will happen next week. Any questions on that? Okay, one thing that, before you ask a question, so Jason had these cool cards printed. So there are about, how many? 1,000?
1,000.
There are 1,000. So I didn't count them. I don't know if you did to verify. But anyway, they sent us a box of 1,000. So they're pretty cool. On the front of them it says you're invited, Mission Community Church. On the other side it has our lead pastor's name, his email address, and then it has the location. So the Sheraton Fraser, Great Valley has the address, and then it has the service time, which is every Sunday at 10 a.m. And then on the bottom, it would have our website, our Facebook name or site, and then our Twitter handle, as they're called. But those things are on the bottom. So grab however many you need, however many you feel you could be effective with, hand them out, encourage folks. The one thing I would probably say, it doesn't have September 20th on there, so if you hand them out next week, let's say somebody shows up, they sit there by themselves on a Sunday morning. But you might want to make sure that folks know that. But those are the bags, so pick them up as you go. Those are going to be a great use for all of us. Any questions next week? Sunday? Okay. Invitation cards, those are those. We have them. Mission Kids, where is Shannon or Jen? Anybody want to, you guys want to go through anything?
Just, if you didn't register your kids yet, can you make sure to register them? If I have you on the volunteer list, or email for me this week.
And then how are folks doing that are helping you with, that are getting background checks, fingerprints, any of that stuff done? Do you feel
That's
like?
part of the email this week.
Okay, so check the email.
So yeah, so if you are volunteering, just make sure you get that stuff in. Some of it's pretty quick, which is the one that takes longer, the criminal,
The child
use one, so that one takes
Yeah.
a little bit longer.
Okay.
But the other ones are like instant online, so.
Okay. Where's Russ? Can you help in the back there?
Pardon me?
Can you help him come in?
I got a question for you too.
Yeah, sure.
Isn't it missioncommunity.church?
It is. So our website, you're asking about our website, or you're asking about, yes, okay, so our website, just so everybody knows, is www.missioncommunity.church. A little different. Why? Did you ask why?
I couldn't find it for the longest time.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I
Okay.
kept typing in, it came in all kinds of states that you're.
You know when you sit in a room and you brainstorm, you're like throwing stuff on the wall and all that? I think you did that 100 times with the .com. Then you looked at something else after that. I forgot. .org. And so then .church was one that came up. So I don't know if you want to explain why we picked that, but it was pretty easy.
So it's a new, what do they call those, domains?
Domain. Yeah.
That are available that churches are starting to use, because you're not really a .com, a commercial business. You're kind of an org, but all different kinds of mission community somethings were all taken. And then .net, yeah, it's just not. So the .church was just kind of attractive, new. It explains what you are, a church. So that's what we're going for.
So we need to remember that because
Yep.
people are Googling Mission Community Church,
Yeah.
you'll go everywhere except where you want to go.
Yeah. So I always say, when I tell people about the church, Mission Community Church, and then give them the website, it almost re-solidifies in their mind what the name of the church, because you had to explain the dot church.
Yeah.
So if you
It's
use
good.
those in tandem together, usually that helps solidify.
Just one other quick question. Are you planning to archive your sermons on your website?
Yes,
Yeah, so we're gonna video today,
we are.
so trial run.
Trying, yeah,
Last announcement, so giving, as far as all that goes, we still have online, you can go to the website, missioncommunity.church, you can select giving, you can go on there, set up recurring, you can talk to Mike's right here, about the ACH, it's an automated clearinghouse where you can go directly from your account, your checking account into the Mission Community account. So talk to Mike if you'd like to administratively set that up. But a lot of that is ready to go, so we'll continue to update you. I think part of that will be in today's lesson. And one of the cool things about today that Jason had given me a little bit of the verses that he was going to use, and in there, one of the words that is used is desiring, and the fact that God desires, what you desire is what you ultimately fulfill and what you want to sustain. And the cool part about being in here is these four walls allow us to desire a connection with God. It allows us to go out of here and then proclaim what we learn, what we believe in our heart. And so I just ask you to be prepared to connect with that and what you're desiring out of being here today. And what do you think God is desiring you to do? So let's just pray, and then we can move into worship. God, I just thank you for all of us being here together today, and for the beautiful weather that you've provided over the last really 4 or 5 days. And as we prepare to go into a season of new beginnings, and this ability for us to go through a trial run, and then for us to go into this really launch, I just pray that you'll continue to work in our hearts. You'll continue to provide us with wisdom and connection with you, and for us to have that outpouring of what we all desire and why we're here, so that others will see that we're that influence that they need, so that we can glorify you. So we just pray that you'll be with us today, as we worship you and hear from Jason. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good morning. We're going to move into a time of worship, and I know sometimes this room is small and people can hear your voice because it's not a big stage and big lights and music. But I just want to invite you this morning just to stand as we worship together and just really commune with the Lord and spend some time with Him this morning as we sing a couple of songs.
My foes are many, they rise against me, but I will hold my ground. I will not fear the war, I
can go ahead and take a seat. So a line in that song, in that chorus, oh, and run to your arms, and run to your arms. The riches of your love will always be enough. So do we understand what we're singing in that line itself? That the riches of your love will always be enough, despite the circumstances, despite what's happening around me, despite good or bad. Can we actually mean that? Do we mean that when we sing, your love will always be enough? As we enter into saying the creed this morning, again, one of the reasons why we're going to continue to do this is because the Apostles' Creed is one of the foundational statements of belief in the church. It is a belief that the books of the Bible were filtered through before they actually were compiled into this nice leather-bound, gold-leaf book, red letters of Jesus. And so as we enter into this recitation this morning of the Creed, the one line I want you to think about is, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. So what does that mean to you? Just take a moment. What does that mean that I believe in God who created everything, creator of heaven and earth? Just think about that for a moment. And we'll read a couple of verses out of Colossians, and then we'll recite this together. So Colossians chapter 1, starting verse 15 says this: He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. So if God is creator of all the earth, what are some things that implies? Feel free to shout that out. Anything that comes to your mind. If he is creator of heaven and earth, everything that's visible and invisible, what does that imply in a statement like that?
There was a plan. It's not random. There was a plan.
Okay, yeah.
It's incredibly powerful if you think that he spoke and created.
Yeah.
It came to be because of what he said.
Right.
He's in control even with all the marvelousness and the things we see. He's still in control.
Yeah. So the sovereignty of God.
He has ownership of all.
Yeah. So if you're the creator of something, you own that something. So being creator of heaven and earth, he is in possession and owns all of it. Invisible and visible. So as we start to go down that path a little bit, that is a big concept for us to try to grasp. Anything else before we go and sing or say it? Rob?
And everything's created in his time.
Yeah. Which is another crazy thing, because in his economy there is no time. Yet in ours, we have this chronological time. He's eternal, so that even starts to mess with your mind a little bit. All right, so let's say this creed together. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, God's only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the third day he rose again. He ascended into heaven. He is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. Amen. So again, as we say this week to week, hopefully it doesn't just become words that we get in the routine of just spitting out, but as we take time to focus in on certain phrases, my hope is that it brings new life to it, that it helps explain why we are saying some of these words, and then ultimately, this is a summary of what we believe in as a Christian community of faith. It's a summary of the gospel, and so there's great weight in this, and looking forward to seeing how we can continue to unpack it as the weeks go on. So as we start today, we're going to go into a little bit of a review time. So, as we review this morning, individually and corporately together as a church, what is our purpose? Anybody? To glorify God. So, as believers in Jesus Christ, whether we are out on our own or we're in this context as a community of faith, as a church, our purpose ultimately is to glorify God. 1 Corinthians 10:31. Whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of God. As believers, individually and or corporately as a church, what is our mission? Can you say that aloud?
To make disciples.
To make disciples. Okay? So before Jesus ascended into heaven, he was talking to his disciples. He said, all authority has been given to me. Go into all the world and make disciples. So as followers of Jesus, both individually and then corporately as a church, our mission is to make disciples. Let's pull up, go to the next slide. Mission Community Church, go ahead, exists, fill in the blank, to glorify God by helping people meet, know, and follow Jesus through gospel-centered worship. Somebody did his homework. Keep going. Worship. Community. Service and growth. So let's go ahead and say this together. Mission Community Church exists to glorify God by helping people meet, know, and follow Jesus through gospel-centered worship, community, service, and growth. And so as you see this, it has our purpose, both individually and corporately as a church. Our purpose is to glorify God. It has our mission in there to make disciples. We're changing that language a little bit to say we are helping people meet, know, and follow Jesus. That's ultimately what making a disciple is. It's all founded in the gospel. It all starts with the gospel. So everything that we do is gospel-centered worship, community, service, and growth. Those are the 4 values that we are placing as a church. So worship, whether that's together as a community of faith singing songs and praises to Him, or we're out in our workplaces, anything that we do, we're trying to worship Him. We are created as worshiping beings, and so are we worshiping the right object? God. Community is the central element when it comes to a community of faith, when it comes to a church. Are we living in biblical community with one another? We'll unpack that a little bit more as time goes on. Service, we look at the example of Jesus and how He came to serve and not to be served. And so as Christians, we also serve those around us. We serve one another. We serve the community at large. And then growth. He does it all. You'll hear me use the phrase, if we are making disciples, Jesus will build His church. It's not our responsibility to worry about building the church. Jesus got that. He says, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So as long as we're being obedient to Him, through worship, community service, making disciples, His church is going to grow. Okay? So let's say it one more time. Mission Community Church exists to glorify God by helping people meet, know, and follow Jesus through gospel-centered worship, community, service, and growth. Next slide. Let's say it again. Mission Community Church exists to glorify God by helping people meet, know, and follow Jesus through gospel-centered worship, community, service, and growth. Yes. So when people ask you, hey, what's Mission Community Church all about? There it is. That's the summary statement of it. Okay? Now, our vision is to be a blank blank on a blank blank. Who can fill that in? A gospel what? A gospel people on a gospel mission. All right? So our vision ultimately, as we do life together, as we grow deeper in the gospel, is to become a gospel people that are simply on a gospel mission. So it's not just in the confines of the church gathering where this happens. It is wherever God has placed us, in our workplaces, our neighborhoods, families. Are we a gospel people on a gospel mission? That's what we're hoping to become. So, once again, our vision statement is to be a gospel people on the gospel mission. What do we have next here? All right. So we're going to take a break this week from the Life on Mission study. And just my hope today is just have an open conversation when it comes to finances, more specifically when it comes to giving towards the church, and outline a little bit of, okay, these are some of the things that we had thought through the last couple of months. Here's what some of our expenses are to start the church. Here are some of our monthly expenses, and really just have an open conversation on this. Because we are in a biblical community, people tend to shy away from this in the big church. My hope is that we just, again, have a conversation about it. So I'm going to be asking questions along the way. Please participate, and let's just see what God does in it all, okay? Before we do that, next slide, want to give you some statistics, okay? So total Christian income in the United States is $4.2 trillion. So you take all the Christians in the U.S., combine their income for $5.2 trillion. That's over half of all the Christians in the entire world. So we live in one of the richest nations on earth, yet we have a lot of debt. It's kind of this weird thing going on. Anyway, we make $5.2 trillion as Christians. If all U.S. Christians gave 10%, and that's coming from tithing in the Old Testament, and I'll explain that a little bit later. If all U.S. Christians gave 10%, then we'd have about $520 billion available for ministry. $25 billion would relieve global hunger. $15 billion would solve the world's water issues, sanitation, clean water. $12 billion would eliminate illiteracy in 5 years. And then $1 billion would fully fund world missions. So if all Christians gave 10% of their income, there would be $520 billion available for ministry. If you just subtracted these four things, you would still have $450 plus billion to do the work of the ministry. Next slide. For Christians making less than $20,000 annually, this is in the U.S., 8% of those give 10% of income to the church. For Christians making $75,000 or more annually, 1% of those give 10% of income to the church. So does anybody know what that is saying?
Looks like one's pretty generous and one's not.
The more you make, the less you're giving.
Yes! The more you make, the less people are giving. Nearly 40% of evangelical Christians do not give to the church. The average donation of those who attend U.S. Protestant churches is about $17 a week. Okay. Now let me clarify, this isn't to guilt anybody, it's just to, as we were starting a church, these are some of the things that we looked at. And people are like, why are you starting a church? So just to see what statistics are. Let's go on to the next one. When we did our vision nights over the summer, Justin would talk about our values when it comes to finances. And so we had talked through, okay, as we start this church, we are ultimately trusting that the Lord is our supply. It comes out of Philippians 4, that He will supply all of our needs according to the riches in Christ Jesus. So God is in control of that. We're not necessarily worried about that because we know that ultimately He's in control of it all. He's going to supply our needs. We're also, as a church, relying on the tithes or the giving of the church. In Malachi, it's an Old Testament passage that talks about bringing your tithes to the storehouses. And God lays a challenge out to His people and says, bring your tithes forward and see that I not open up the floodgates of heaven and rain down blessing upon you. And so we're relying on the tithes of the church. Our hope as we do that is to bless others through the resources of the church. And so that whole concept started way back with Abraham, when God said, I am blessing you to be a blessing to others. So as a people of God, as a community of faith, our hope is to bless those in this community of faith, but also to bless others in the larger community around us. And then finally, he said, our hope is to remain debt-free. That one is a pretty big statement to make, a pretty big hope, a big prayer. But if we really believe that the Lord is our supply and He'll supply all of our needs, then it's really not that big when you think about it. Okay? So let's go on to the next one. I want to take us through a little bit of just a quick overview of what giving looked like in the Old Testament and how that has changed in the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, you have this word tithe, which is derived from the word meaning tenth. And so the people of God, Israel, was required to give a tithe, a tenth of their first fruits, a tenth of their gross income. You can see that in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There's different passages I have up there. In addition to that, they were required to tithe 10% to festivals and holidays. So the Old Testament people, they loved to party, ultimately, and celebrate around God. And they gave money for the party. They also were required to give 3.3% to the poor. And then every 7 years, you had some other bigger feasts that came along that people had to give towards. So when you total all of that up, Israel was required to give more than 25% of their income to God. Okay? Of their total resources. What's the next slide real quick? All right, go back. So, I'm going to use a story of Colleen and I, and how, as we weave through these next few slides, kind of inject this story. When Colleen and I were married, got married, we didn't tithe very much. There was a point, for some reason, in the first year of our marriage where just God really convicted us about giving to the church. He had blessed us pretty well. Colleen was making good money doing hairstylists down in Chapel Hill. So she had a lot of doctors and a lot of professors and a lot of rich people and was making really good money cutting hair, nonetheless. I was making a good salary at a pharmaceutical company. And so God had just gave us tremendous blessing when it comes to material things. We built a brand new house when we were 2 years into our marriage. It was our dream house. Nice cars, had really no worries at all. In that first year or two of our marriage, God then started convicting us about giving. And it was through a series of our church that we did in North Carolina that all came about. And so we started to tithe regularly. And as we prayed through that and what that looked like, we just landed on 10%. I don't think that's a requirement today, but for us, as we prayed about that and decided in our hearts what we were going to do, we decided to give 10% of our gross income. When we moved to come up here, we continued to give 10% of our income, but we built our house at the height of the market. When we sold our house, everything had tanked. It took us a year to sell our house. We moved in with Colleen's mom. We were no longer making the nice luxurious salaries of a hairstylist in Chapel Hill and a biotech person in North Carolina. We were now living on a pastor's salary in Pennsylvania. I'm going to stop there, and I want to move on to this next slide to explain what our thought process was when we started thinking about, okay, what would giving look like in a new church, potentially. We had kind of settled on Exton as our target area. So then we looked at Exton and then the surrounding cities around it. So you have Chester Springs, Downingtown, Exton where we're targeting, Malvern, and Westchester. This is all based on 2014 data. Okay, so the average household income in Chester Springs, $170,000. Downingtown, $118,500. Exton, $121,000. So on and so forth. You can see those statistics on the screen. Okay. Because we were looking a little bit more at Exton, we started to play with numbers and look at other statistics. So go on to the next slide. We said, what is the average giving household income, I should say, in different radii coming out of Exton? So 3-mile radius of Exton, the average household income is $118,000. 5-mile radius, $113,000, so it drops a little bit. But then 7 mile and 10 mile starts to pick up a little bit because you start going towards the main line, Paoli, Malvern, Wayne, all those very well off areas. So it's like, okay, let's look at worst case scenario, the lowest number, not worst case scenario, but let's just look at the lowest number, 113,000 average household income. So what we started looking at, okay, so if we had, next slide, 20 families, 30 families, 40 families, 50 families, giving different percentages of that. This is where we started to build a framework for, okay, what might it look like? So you can see if 20 families gave 10% based on a $113,000 income, then we could expect $226,800 annually. 30 families, you can see how that goes. We looked at, okay, we know that people don't give 10%, all people. So what would it look like at 5%? So you can see $113,004 if 20 families gave 5% of their income. The national average for giving in the church is 2.5% of income, okay? So we started looking at that. Okay, that's the national average. Let's use that and see what we can expect. So 20 families giving 2.5% of their income, that's about $3,000 a year. That's what we could expect. Next slide. We looked at, okay, we had 20 core families. Let's say 20 core families are completely committed, devoted to God and to Mission Community Church. What would that look like at 10%? To lessen that a little bit, what would we still need to make that same number of 226? We looked at, okay, you need to double that amount of families giving if they were to give 5%. If people were to stick with the national average at 2.5%, we would actually need 80 families giving at 2.5% to make that 226,800 number. So that's just some of the thought processes that we went through when looking at a church. That would bring in roughly just shy of $20,000 a month. Okay, next slide. In the New Testament, it all changes. And it's all changed because foundationally you have Jesus giving of himself to make us rich ultimately. He left his heavenly throne. He was pretty rich, we would agree, right? I mean, creator of heaven and earth. He's the owner of everything that there is. He's a pretty rich guy. He sits on a throne. He has angels around him worshiping him. He's a pretty rich guy. He decided to leave for our sake to become poor. He was born in a manger. His father was a carpenter. He grew up in a town with a couple of dozen families. His room, his house was probably a quarter the size of this room in here that his whole family grew up in. So in the New Testament, you have the word tithe, which again means tenth. It's only mentioned 4 places, okay? And it's mentioned in a little bit of a negative light. So you have Jesus rebuking the Pharisees. He said, "Woe you Pharisees, you give 1/10 of your cumin and your dill, your first fruits, yet you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, which is love, justice, and mercy. So in those 3 of those verses in the Gospels here, that is the context. That Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees because the Pharisees are puffed up. They are proclaiming to everybody that they are giving their 10%. Yet Jesus is saying, your heart's not behind it. You're neglecting the weightier matters of the law. You're neglecting loving one another. You are neglecting justice. You are neglecting mercy. And so they have missed the whole point of giving in the first place. And then Jesus himself actually gave too. So we talked about how poor Jesus was. There's actually a funny passage in Matthew chapter 17 where a tax collector comes and talks to Peter and says, hey, doesn't Jesus, your teacher, doesn't he tax or give to the government? And Peter says yes. And then Jesus turns to Peter and says, hey, or Peter goes to Jesus, how are we going to afford this tax? Jesus says, go catch a fish. The first fish that you catch will have a coin in it. Go give that to be taxed. That's broke poor. I mean, have you ever been in that place where you're so poor, you're hoping to catch a fish with an unlimited American Express card? I mean, that's pretty poor. Yet, Jesus says later in that passage, basically the idea is you render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. It's not that same verse, but it says, we give to man, the government that is over us, but we also give to God. So in that whole context, Jesus is giving, yet he is using his own life as an example because here he is, the rich creator of the universe, making himself poor so that we might be rich in him. And there's more than just material riches that he's talking about. He's talking more about the heavenly blessings and the life that we have in him. Next slide. So question I want to ask, and if we could discuss a little bit. How do you determine how much to give and what to give towards? And if you're willing to answer that question, I would appreciate it. Wow.
Well, I think that in Malachi 3, his principle on tithing, 10% is a starting point for tithing.
Okay.
That's pretty well thought, but not where we're supposed to just end. There's a saying that I was just listening to yesterday. I've heard it many times, and it's probably not the proper quote, but you can live better on 90% with God than live on 100% without God.
Okay.
God does bless those who give, not necessarily financially, but spiritual blessings. And as I was looking at your chart and everything of the median income, I thought, wow, that's pretty high. I mean, I'm kind of shocked at that. And in the New Testament, there was the woman who gave a mite, which is like, I think less than a penny or I don't know how much it was, but very, very little. But Jesus said that she gave more. So it's not the amount that a person gives, it's in conjunction with what you make and what your heart is. In the New Testament, Christ says that where your treasure is, there is your heart also. Or where your heart is, there is your treasure also. So when we do kingdom work in giving, we're actually heaping blessings on ourselves, by the Lord.
I can go home Yeah, but so how do you determine how much you give and where to give?
I have a question when
Yeah.
you said that when Jesus came to change things.
Mhm.
So what did you mean by that?
So, okay, yeah, so in the Old Testament, tithing, giving was law. People had to do it. It was, you didn't really have an option. You also had to give your taxes. So in the Old Testament, there's law, that's what you're supposed to do. In the New Testament, through Jesus' example of the gospel, it doesn't become a law anymore, it becomes grace. And so there is a heart element, a motivation that comes into why we give and how much we give and to what we give. So we'll unpack that a little bit more. So yeah, that's the difference. Yep.
And to be a cheerful giver, because if you're giving out of law
Right.
and begrudgingly, that's
Right.
not what God wants.
And that's where it goes back to where Jesus was rebuking the Pharisees. I mean, they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. They were giving their 10%, but their heart was not in it. They were neglecting far more weightier things. So,
Yeah, I think that's a question I've heard a number of times. Is it gross or net? Is it the actual cash that you have?
yeah.
Or is it the total before? Because our Caesar takes a lot more than probably Caesar did that.
Yeah, he does. Caesar is, yeah. So, I think there's two answers to that. Yeah, there's two answers to that question. In the Old Testament, first fruits, I would argue, gross. In the New Testament, because of the gospel, that changes. And we're going to unpack that a little bit, so I don't want to give you the full answer to that right yet. But hang on to that.
And is your tithe based on, for the church, or what about your other giving too?
Right.
To Christian organizations, so I've always been wondering about that.
Yeah. Yes. Dee.
First of all, I think you take it to prayer like your comment did. I heard it preached that the 10% was to your church. That was your base, like Mom said, and then you're giving to whatever else God calls you to.
Right.
He doesn't need our money, he wants our hearts.
Right. Right.
It's all his money anyway. I mean, that's the biggest thing.
Who's saying it? Yep.
I think you have to realize it's his.
Right.
And, and just quick aside, I'm a CPA, most people don't know that. The majority of my clients are over the median age.
Right.
Probably the 2.5%, sadly enough, is more the reality of what you see than the 10% or the 5%.
Yeah, the 2.5% is actually the national average of giving in churches. Yeah.
However, when my clients, when I'm going through information and it's more towards the 8 to 10%, inevitably, when I just curiosity go through and look at what churches they give to, it's usually non-denominational. So believers still are, and I'm just saying on my small sphere,
Yeah, right.
are still well over the national average.
Right. Right. Good. So any more thoughts on how do you determine how much to give and what to give towards? Jeremy?
I think it's important to also think outside of just your own local church. Sue and I can talk about this. We've gone through and identified a couple of groups or missionaries that we're faithful to.
Right.
That I think if we met this old Jewish fellow, he always talked about the goblet and the saucer. And how he would take a goblet, set it on a saucer, and he poured wine into it. And fill up the goblet, and then the overflow went to, so he said, the goblet is my family, which, example would be our church. And then the overflow fell into the saucer, which would be, other organizations
Sure.
and stuff like that. But he said, make sure you have a saucer.
Sure. Yeah.
A good analogy,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
same thing.
Good. Dan?
Yeah, so growing up in the church, I hear a lot, the financial tithing and all that stuff. Coming from a little bit more of a legalistic background, it was very much, if you're not doing tithe 10%, you're sinning.
Sure.
Not overtly expressed that way, it was implied.
Sure.
And so, as through the course of my Christian walk, investigating myself and understanding the New Testament grace and not giving out of compulsion, but God was a cheerful giver. And a passage kind of struck me, I don't even know, maybe 10 years ago or so, where it was David. It was on the threshing floor, and someone wanted to give him this. David goes to the man to try to buy his land to give as an offering to the Lord, and the guy wanted to give it to him for free.
Right.
And David said, I will not sacrifice to the Lord that which costs me nothing.
Yeah.
And so that has kind of been for me probably like the anthem. And full disclosure, our giving has been based on kind of life events.
Yeah.
And, you know, gone through some significant stuff where we just can't.
Right.
Or we can, and when can we do that sort of thing. So I guess,
Yeah.
when we can, just kind of fall on the grace, and like, hopefully we can get back to what we were doing before and
Right.
keep going that way.
Yeah, because you can have a single mom making $40,000 a year, where 10%, she's going to feel every percent of that 10%. You can have somebody making $500,000 a year who gives 10%, and they may not feel it all. So it is there, and we're gonna get into this. It's a great passage on giving that let's just go into there now. Next slide. So we're gonna hang out in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, right? 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 is a great passage when it talks about giving towards the church. I am basically just going to start reading through this and just unpack these 8 principles that I kind of pulled out of this passage. You can probably argue for a few more principles that come out, but these are just ones that really jumped out at me, and you'll see why. So let me just set the context a little bit for 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, the Corinthian church, so Paul's writing to the Corinthians, the Corinthian church has committed to give to the church, more specifically to the church in Jerusalem. So there had been famine that hit. Jerusalem was basically the epicenter of the church. All of the church planning missions that were happening at the time were coming out of Jerusalem. So when it started off, when we start in a couple weeks on September 20th, we're going to start in the book of Acts. We're going to see in the very early chapters of Acts how the people of God came together. They were selling their possessions and giving it to the church to use as they seemed fit. I mean, they were very wealthy and well off to start with. But then famine came, economic downturns came, Jerusalem was struggling. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul writes and acknowledges that the Corinthian church is wanting to give to Jerusalem. Okay? He's writing in 2 Corinthians because they hadn't followed through with the giving. So we pick it up in chapter 8, in verse 1. Paul says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia." So it's important for us to stop there, because the whole foundation of our giving is based on the grace of God. So without scanning over the verses immediately following verse 1, let's jump to verse 9 real quick, okay? So in verse 9, Paul says, "For you know the grace of our Lord," so we're talking about this idea of grace. "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich." So we already started talking about this idea of the richest person in the world, God himself, creator of heaven and earth, left his throne, became poor so that we might become rich. So our motivation first begins with grace, begins with the gospel. That's why you'll see this language. How can we proclaim the gospel with our finances? That's where it starts. If you remember in those vision nights that we held, I used the phrasing that our love for God and our love for people ought to motivate everything that we do. Okay? So it's all rooted in the gospel. Let's go back to verse 1. Okay? "So we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia." So Paul is writing to Corinthians. He is using the church at Macedonia as an example. Verse 2. "For in severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part." So you have the Macedonian church that is experiencing some tremendous hard times. Some affliction is the word that he uses. Yet, in that affliction, and because of the grace of God, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty, they weren't rich by any stretch of the imagination, have flowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So the first principle is give generously. Going back to our values financially as a church, if we believe that God is our supply, that as Rob said, he is owner of it all, we're ultimately just stewards of the things that he's given us, then be generous in giving. Verse 3, for they gave according to their means. Okay, so they gave based on what they had, based on their income, based on their situation. As I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord. Now think about this with me. How can you give according to your means, but then also give beyond your means? So I'm pretty sure they didn't have credit cards back then. So how do you do that? What does that even look like? And I really can't explain that other than it starts in verse 1, through the grace of God. So somehow God supplied their needs, and yet more than they could afford on their own accord. So, principle number 2, give sacrificially. Because we serve a God who ultimately gave his own life for us, he gave us all that he is, then our giving should probably cause us to feel it a little bit. All right? Keep going. Verse 4. Begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. So Macedonia, they're afflicted, they're poor, yet they're generous, they're giving, it hurts in their giving, yet they are earnestly looking to give. They're not giving out of reluctance or out of hesitation. They are earnest with it. They are looking to give. So give earnestly. Verse 5. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. We reiterate that idea of love God and love people ought to motivate everything that we do. So they gave themselves to the Lord, and then they gave themselves to Paul and the church in Jerusalem. Okay? Let's skip down to verse 7. But as you excel in everything, in faith and speech, and so he's talking to the Corinthian church here, as you, Corinthians, excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. So in a, not a weird way, but in a way, Paul is challenging the Corinthians to outgive the Macedonians. So it almost becomes not a game, but it's, hey, look what they're doing. You have excelled in all of your gifts. If you remember back in Corinthians, they're always arguing about their spiritual gifts and how blessed they were because of the spiritual gifts that they had. And he's saying, so if you're excelling in all of these things, also excel in this area, in your giving. Verse 8, I say this not as a command. Okay? Not as a command. It's not a law anymore for us to give the 10%, the tithe. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. Again, reiterating this idea that our giving comes out of a motivation of a heart. So our giving ultimately isn't a money issue, it's a heart issue. Okay? The Pharisees, look, we give 10%. Jesus rebukes them and said, yeah, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, love, mercy, and justice. And so let love be the motivation. Principle number 4, give lovingly. That is why we do it. Verse 9, this is where we talked about the grace of God and why we give in this way. Skip down to verse 12. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. So this idea of readiness kind of ties in with this idea of earnestly giving. But as we give readily, we give based on what we have. We make it a priority. We make it a regular practice in our household, if you will. So based on whatever it is that God has given us to steward, then we readily give whatever portion that we determine back to God. All right? Verse 12 also has this idea. what is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he doesn't have. So there is an element of wisdom that we need to bring into this, where a person who makes $50,000 a year shouldn't be tithing $100,000 a year, obviously. So according to what God has given us, what he has blessed us with, make a wise decision on that. When you read through verses 16 through 24, we won't read through those, but it's actually a kind of a cool passage where there's these checks and balances that Paul puts into place so that he doesn't get accused of money laundering or anything like that. He has different guys that are overseeing all of the financials, the gifts that they are receiving. So verses 16 through 24 kind of outline that, the protections that they have in place. So that's kind of an interesting passage. We're going to jump to chapter 9. Now it is not superfluous for me, verse 1, to write to you about the ministry for the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia. So he's saying, I told Macedonia all the great things that's happening to you, Corinth, to you, church, and how you're going to give. Yet, remember, they hadn't started giving yet. And so he's almost giving them a heads up. Hey, I'm going to be coming. Would you have that gift available so that when a part of my team from Macedonia, my financial team comes with me, they're not caught off guard because you all aren't ready to give. Verse 6, he starts to hone in a little bit more on these principles of giving. Straightforward, verse 6, the point is this. Okay? Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So we have this idea of give cheerfully, number 8. But number 7, give decidedly. And this is where I believe the big difference happens from New Testament grace giving from Old Testament tithing. Okay? Paul says in verse 7, each one must give as he has decided in his heart. Ultimately, the decision of how much you give and to what you give is between you and God. Between you and God. There is no law or set percentage or number that you have to give. At least in my belief and my understanding of the New Testament. So it goes to your question, Rob. Should you give on gross or net? That's not the point. The point is it's a decision in the New Testament. It's a decision between you and God and how God has blessed you. And how can you leverage your resources for the sake of the gospel? How can we proclaim the gospel with our finances? Verse 8. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. It goes back to our principle that we take out of Philippians. God is our supply. He will meet our needs. Both individually and families, as we give to Him through the church, as we give to different mission organizations or missionaries, as we support our Compassion or World Vision kids, God will supply our needs. If we believe that He supplies the sparrow in the air and the lily in the valley, how much more will He supply our needs? He is able to make all grace abound to you. But the other principle is whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Verse 6. Basically, as we give more, maybe He returns more to us in financial blessing, but there's probably other blessings that aren't always material or financial as we give. So have you ever been to a place where you gave to something or someone, and just out of that generosity, it felt good. It felt like the right thing to do. There was no hesitation. There was no angst about it. You just knew God was calling you to do it, and in some way, you ended up receiving a blessing in it because you gave. That's the grace of God. Jump down to verse 13 of chapter 9. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others. This underlying purpose of bringing glory to God, it's true as we gather together and sing praises to Him. It's true as we work our hardest in whatever job He has placed us to bring glory to Him. It's true as we give of our finances back to Him. It's all for the glory of God, to fulfill that purpose. And then he closes out chapter 9. Thanks be to God for His inexpressible gift. He goes back to grace. He goes back to the gospel. That is the ultimate example of giving. The rich King of the universe becoming poor to make us rich. So for Colleen and I, going back to our story, we had decided on 10%. That's just what we decided. We decided that was gross. So before, we live in a country, unfortunately, where Uncle Sam takes our money. Taxes, steals, whatever you want to call it. But we decided in our hearts as we prayed that we would give 10% to the church of whatever our gross income was. So when we moved up here, it took us a year to sell our house. We had a pretty hefty mortgage payment. On a pastor's salary, we were not making ends meet. We wiped out our stock plans, wiped out our retirement to pay for the house down in North Carolina that we weren't living in, yet we were continuing to give 10% to the church. And there was a point in there where we were struggling and we tried to justify in our minds, hey, we're pastor, they'll understand. We don't have to give our 10%. Not that they necessarily know what we were doing, but these were some of the things that we were wrestling with in that very tight, financial, stressful time. When we sold our house, we were told beforehand that we wouldn't have to bring any money to closing. Okay? We show up at closing, at the table, we had to write a check for $17,000 to sell our house. We lost $60,000 in our house. Colleen and I both started crying at the closing table because we had wiped out our retirement, we had wiped out our stock options, we were $55,000 plus in debt from student loans. We were finally relieved to get rid of this house payment, thinking that we didn't have to pay anything. Yet, we're told, no, you owe $1,700. When we wrote that check, we had $15.82 to our name at the time. As a man, trying to provide for his family, that was pretty humbling. Yet, we remained faithful in giving our 10%, what we had decided God was calling us to do. The next several months, God did incredible things. We would have $500 checks show up in the mail. We weren't out there announcing that we were broke. $15.82 in the bank account, I kid you not. We didn't have savings, plus the $55,000 debt school loans that we were paying. Lord, how are we going to make ends meet? Checks started to show up out of nowhere. And then, because we had the blessing of moving in with her mom, we didn't have to pay for rent or mortgage up here until we could start saving some money up and make that down payment on a house eventually. Through that whole experience, I learned that God is my supply. He is going to take care of our needs. It might not be what I want it to be. I sure wish it was more than $15 in that bank account. But ultimately, He supplied for our needs. We're in a similar place today. Not like we were back then, let me say that. But here we are, we're launching a church. And because we had seen God supply in the past, we know that He's going to do it again. He's faithful and just to do that. Next slide, if you would. So we know that he is our supply. We are relying on the tithes of the church to do ministry here. We are hoping to bless others through the resources of the church while remaining debt-free. So you'll continue to see this as we progress as a church, whatever that looks like. Next slide. These are some of the things that we started talking about a couple of weeks ago. So when we look at what's it going to cost us to start this thing, what is it going to cost to make Sundays happen in a way that is not distracting, based on the technologically savvy culture that we're in? How much will that cost? And so we put a list together of all the audio visual equipment that we would need. What are some of the things in the Mission Kids department? Because that's one of the priorities that we have right now. We have a lot of kids coming our way. So what do we need to make that run smoothly? And so we came up with a number of $21,000. That was on the website under the startup expense page. We ended up listing out all those different items that we were looking at buying. Fortunately, last week and this week, we've purchased or started purchasing a big chunk of the audio-visual stuff. So if you go on the website now, a lot of that has been taken off, and there's still some areas in like the Mission Kids stuff that we're looking to get. Couple more things in the worship, music, things that aren't necessarily a priority. They would be nice to have, like an electronic drum kit, but we don't need that right now. So you'll see some of those things that are still on the list. Then we started breaking down, okay, so what is the monthly cost going to look like? So in that, right now, we are looking, ultimately wanting to make at least $10,000 a month to make ends meet. So that comes from monthly subscriptions and fees. So we have different services that we use primarily through Planning Center for planning services, for checking in kids, for online giving. There's fees that are associated with that. We have the Sheraton rent. So starting next week, we're going to start paying weekly on what that rent's going to be. And then one full-time employee. In parentheses, you'll see 2 full-time employees. If we were looking to add another person, we would bump that up to another $5,000. You know that in this area, it's not the cheapest area in the United States to live. And so that's where we're estimating some of what that might look like if we wanted to bring on another full-time pastor employee of some sorts. So this is what we're looking at. Minimally, right now, as it stands, hopefully $10,000 a month. If we were to add another person, that would probably bump up to around $15,000. So right now, as a church, the majority of the expenses are in me. And that's where there is great humility in that, because in a way, I'm relying on the church to give, to help support me. And there is a weird, very humbling feeling when you are looking at the people that would help support you. As we grow, Lord willing, in the years to come, that's going to end up shifting. You know, as we run into, who knows if we end up purchasing a building, what are the daily expenses, weekly expenses of that going to be to actually run the building. You'll end up seeing that percentage end up swing to where expenses will primarily be in this operations type of a bucket, okay? This is what we're looking at. Next slide. Here's my application for us today. So sometime this week, maybe today or this week, read through 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 on your own. Read through it a few times, because there's a lot of principles in there that you'll get new things come out of it each time you read it. Pull up some commentaries if you have access to those, maybe on the internet, and just dig into those 2 chapters a little bit and allow the Holy Spirit to work in you of what does that mean for you. Number 2, prayerfully consider how much to give. How much and to what? For Colleen and I, we are remaining at that 10%. So as I start receiving a salary, Lord willing, from Mission Community Church, 10% of that will go right back into the church. We also have, you're talking about the soul search area. We have compassion kids that we support. We have missionary kids or missionaries that we support. And for us, we spent time praying through that as a couple and just seeing how God would lead us in what we would give and how much to give. Only you can decide that. You and your spouse and God. So I'm not here saying 10% is what you ought to do. No, in the New Testament, when it's grace giving and we're not bound by the law and giving the tithes, that is between you and God. And applying the 8 principles of grace giving and see God supply all of your needs. So there's principles that come out of 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. How does that influence how much and to what you give? Final slide is this. If we had 20 families that would commit to $750 a month, we would bring in $15,000. If we had 20 families give $500 a month, it would be $10,000. That's what we currently need right now, $10,000 a month. If we had 20 families give $375, you can see how that chart works out for you. I would ask maybe consider one of these numbers if you're able to make it. But most importantly, and at the end of the day, it's between you and God. And He is the God of all grace. He will meet our needs. Only you can decide what that is. For some of you, that might be a relief. I don't have to give the 10%. For others of you, that might bring great stress because, no, I want a number. Just give me a number. We have that religious side of us that just tell us what we need to do. I can't give that to you. Ultimately, it's between you and God.